In the middle of a famine that had already killed tens of thousands of his own people, the Emperor of China asked a question that has survived, almost word for 1700 years. Why don't they eat meat porridge instead? That emperor's name was Sima Zhong, and here's the thing about that question. His tragedy was never that he was foolish enough to ask it. The real tragedy is that his father, the founding emperor, already knew exactly how foolish he was and handed him the empire anyway. Let's back up to where this actually happened. Outside Luoyang, the roads were littered with the starved dead. The chronicles record it plainly. In the Yongjia years, tens of thousands starved to death in the heartland around the old capital, and the phrase "people ate each other" appears again and again in the Book of Jin. At that exact moment inside the palace, someone told the emperor his people had no grain left, that they were eating grass roots, tree bark, and, in the worst cases, each other. Sima Zhong looked genuinely puzzled. Why don't they eat meat porridge instead? That line became a Chinese idiom in its own right, shorthand for one very specific kind of failure, a man at the absolute summit of power, with absolutely no idea what the world beneath him looked like. And there's a third tragedy underneath the first two. Even a brilliant emperor couldn't have saved this empire by that point. The rot wasn't in the man. It was in the structure. This episode is about the Western Jin dynasty, how it spent 16 years in a civil war, fought entirely within its own ruling family, and effectively killed itself. It's about a throne so friendless that it ended up inviting in its own gravediggers. And it's about the far end of the same century, on the other side of Eurasia, where the Roman Empire was collapsing through an almost identical mechanism.
The choice that Sima Yan planted the bomb. The Sima family had taken power the same way they'd feared losing it, by usurpation. Sima Yan's grandfather and father had spent 2 generations hollowing out the Shaowei imperial house from the inside, until Sima Yan simply finished the job and declared a new dynasty. He understood exactly how Shaowei had fallen. Its imperial clan had been kept deliberately weak, stripped of real military power, and could only watch helplessly as the Sima family took everything. Sima Yan drew a lesson from that. A weak imperial clan gets its throne stolen by outside ministers. So he did the opposite. He enfeoffed his Sima relatives as kings, dozens of them, and not as ceremonial title holders drawing a stipend. These princes commanded real armies, real provincial administrations, real treasuries. Many of them doubled as the supreme military commanders of entire frontier regions. His calculation? A strong imperial clan means no one can pull off what the Sima family just pulled off. In the short term, the logic seemed to hold. But it planted something far more dangerous. Once power is carved up into a collection of armed, self-interested small communities, and the center lacks the authority to keep them in check, the threat no longer comes from ambitious outside ministers. It comes from the princes themselves, from each other. As long as there was one emperor at the center strong enough to command real authority, the system could limp along. Sima Yan himself held it together, barely, for the rest of his reign. Then he handed the throne to Sima Zhong. This exact gamble, handing real military power to armed, semi-autonomous actors bound to their own narrow loyalties first, and to the empire second, if at all, was being made on the other side of Eurasia too, by an empire called Rome. We'll get back to that. First, watch what happens when the man sitting at the center of this arrangement turns out to be an imbecile. Sima Zhong was surrounded, always, by a rotating cast of eunuchs and attendants. There's another anecdote in the histories, recorded even earlier than the meat porridge line, that tells you just as much about the world inside his head. One day, walking through the imperial Hualin garden, he heard frogs croaking from the reeds by a pond. He stopped, turned to the eunuchs beside him, and asked, with total sincerity, "Are these frogs croaking for the state or for themselves?" The eunuchs looked at each other. None of them had any idea how to answer. How do you sort of frogs croak into public or private. Finally, one quick-witted attendant bowed and offered, "The ones on public land croak for the state. The ones on private land croak for themselves." Sima Zhong nodded, thoroughly satisfied. He thought it was an excellent answer. The Book of Jin records both anecdotes, the frogs and the meat porridge, back to back, and closes the passage with a single line. His confusion was always of this kind. Sima Zhong wasn't the archetype of the wise fool that shows up so often in later legend. The histories are direct about it. Limited intelligence, no real capacity for judgment or governance. Sima Yan knew this. He even considered replacing him as heir at one point. In the end, he never worked up the resolve to do it. A man who couldn't grasp why anyone would lack meat porridge was now sitting on a throne that needed to keep a dozen armed uncles and cousins in check. The one who actually filled that power vacuum was Sima Zhong's empress, Jia Nanfeng. Sharp, ruthless, and almost entirely without political foresight. In 291, she allied with a prince of the imperial clan to bring down the regent who had been entrusted with guiding the young reign. His entire clan, to the third degree, was executed. Then, using that same prince as her instrument, she eliminated a second regent. That was round one, and the fuse was lit. The prince who'd just finished killing on her behalf became her next target. She forged an edict accusing him of murdering officials without authorization, and had him executed on the spot. In 3 months, 2 regents and a prince who'd just proven his usefulness were all dead. Then came almost a decade of quiet, not peace, just Yan Nanfeng holding the court in an iron grip, alone. Round 2 started in 299, and burned for 7 straight years without stopping. Jia Nanfeng had no son of her own. When the crown prince, born to a different consort, became a threat to her, she framed him and had him poisoned in the year 300. It was her fatal miscalculation. The court had already resented her grip on power, and the murder of the crown prince handed every rival the perfect justification. 2 princes raised troops to avenge the crown prince, stormed the palace, and executed her. What followed was a blur of betrayal, almost too fast to track. One prince deposed the emperor outright and crowned himself, placing the real emperor under house arrest with an honorary title, only to be crushed within months by a coalition of 3 rival princes who put the rightful emperor back on the throne. The most powerful man in that coalition then monopolized the court alone and was assassinated within the year by another prince who couldn't stomach his arrogance. That assassin's own rule lasted barely 2 years before the 2 princes he'd shut out joined forces against him. After a running battle outside Luoyang, one of his own subordinates turned traitor and burned him alive. 4 different rulers, 4 different violent ends, all within about 5 years. Each one's execution written by whoever outlasted him. The prince left standing, in 304, was Sima Ying, and it was from his newly won seat of power that he made the decision that would rewrite Chinese history. He sent for a Xiongnu noble named Liu Yuan and his soldiers to help lock in his victory. Sima Ying's good fortune didn't last either. The prince of Danhai, Sima Yue, the last of the 8 to enter the stage, and the last to leave it, allied with the governor of Yuzhuo, Wang Jun, who brought in Xianbei cavalry of his own and crushed both Sima Ying and the last of his rivals in turn. He then spent years treating the emperor as his most valuable bargaining chip, dragging a man who had never once been capable of making a decision for himself back and forth between 3 different cities like a piece of luggage. By 306, Sima Yue had finally come out ahead. Later that same year, Sima Zhong died suddenly at the Xianyang Hall in Chang'an, poisoned, the histories say, by a cake. No source names the hand behind it, but the phrase, died from a poisoned cake, and the name Sima Yue have been linked together by historians ever since. Sima Zhong's younger brother succeeded him and changed the era name to Yongjia. The War of the 8 Princes finally ended, not with a resolution, but because the dynasty had nothing left to burn. 16 years, 8 men took the stage in turn. Aside from the first 2 casualties, every one of the other 6 met a violent end, killed on a battlefield, or executed by whichever prince outlasted him. This wasn't a war, it was an entire ruling class spending 16 years methodically killing itself. To understand why Liu Yuan showed up at exactly this moment, in exactly this way, you have to go back 30 years, to when he was still a teenager. Liu Yuan was born into southern Xiongnu nobility. As a boy, he was sent to Luoyang as a hostage, a common arrangement at the time, both between the Han and non-Han peoples, and within non-Han tribes themselves. Send a noble son to the imperial court, and his safety guarantees his clan's loyalty. His years in Luoyang weren't hard ones. He studied under famous Confucian scholars, immersed himself in the Chinese classics, wrote elegantly, and became close friends with well-connected officials, men from prominent families. He attended Western Jin's Grand New Year court ceremonies more than once, watching in person as 10,000 nations paid tribute to the empire. By the standards of the day, he had been thoroughly civilized, assimilated almost completely into the very culture that held him hostage. But he was never going to be from Luoyang. There were always people at court who didn't trust him. Before Jin conquered the rival state of Wu, one official recommended to Emperor Wu that Liu Yuan be given command in the southeast. The conquest, he argued, would be easy. A court attendant objected on the spot. Liu Yuan isn't one of us. He won't truly be loyal. Send him to pacify Wu, and he'll simply crown himself king down there. Later, when a Xianbei chieftain rose in rebellion in the northwest, someone proposed mobilizing the Xiongnu's 5 divisions under Liu Yuan's command to crush it swiftly. The same attendant objected again, more bitterly this time. If we do that, the northwest will never be Jin's again. If Liu Yuan pacifies the west, he'll be a dragon ascending to heaven, coiling through cloud and storm. He will never swim calmly back down into the pond. The histories record a private complaint of his. More suspicion, more slander because of it. I'm afraid, he said, that I'll die unjustly here in Luoyang. A man raised in Chinese culture, hungry for that civilization's acceptance, permanently treated as an outsider anyway. That was Liu Yuan's real situation for decades before the War of the Eight Princes ever began. In 304, his opportunity arrived. Sima Zhong came to him and asked for troops to help tip the balance of the prince's war his way. Liu Yuan didn't refuse, but what he wanted was never just a mercenary contract with one Sima prince. Before he raised his army, an elder of his clan came to him with a proposal. Use this moment, the Sima clan tearing itself apart, to unite with neighboring tribes, revive the Xiongnu nation, and restore the old glory of a legendary Xiongnu who had once unified the entire steppe. Go back to the grasslands. Become a true Xiongnu Khan. Liu Yuan turned him down. His reasoning was direct. That old glory was too small next to what he actually wanted. He intended to match the founding emperor of Han and unify all of China under one throne, or at the very least, match the warlord Cao Cao and unify the north alone. Ruling the steppe was never his ambition. This was never a story about, will the Xiongnu rebel? This is the story of a man raised in Luoyang, educated on Chinese classics, permanently barred from the inner circle of the civilization he'd absorbed, who decided to use that civilization's own rules, its own banners, even the name of its own imperial house, to reshuffle the entire deck. He would later claim descent from the last ruler of the fallen Shu Han kingdom and name his own state, Han. In 304, Liu Yuan raised his banner and declared himself king of Han. He didn't need to wait for the War of the Eight Princes to finish. He already had his own army, his own territory, his own era name. In 308, he declared himself emperor. The hostage once dismissed at the Jin court as incapable of true loyalty was now an emperor in his own right. While the princes tore each other apart and Liu Yuan quietly built his power, the real cost was paid by ordinary people along the Yellow River. The histories describe year after year of natural disaster on top of the war. Locusts, floods, drought, grain prices spiking to dozens of times their normal level. Wherever armies marched, fields were destroyed and granaries emptied. Young men were conscripted by force, and the old, the weak, women and children were left to fend for themselves. The phrase "people ate each other" appears in the Book of Jin again and again, describing this era. This isn't the first time on this channel that we've arrived at a scene like this. At the breaking point of a dynasty's collapse, When famine and war stack on top of each other, the floor under human behavior gives way, again and again, and the living start treating the dead, sometimes the not quite dead, as food. This is, once again, an age of two-legged sheep, and at the summit of power, the princes were still killing each other over who got to sit on the throne. Sima Zhong's "why don't they eat meat porridge" wasn't just one man's ignorance. In a deeper sense, it was the whole ruling class's total indifference to the suffering underneath them, playing out over an entire civil war. What did this catastrophe ultimately cost? The county and commandery administrative system that had run North China for centuries, since the Qin and Han dynasties, broke down within these 16 years. On the ground, survival no longer meant appealing to government officials. It meant finding a strong man who could organize you and your neighbors into a fortified compound and arm yourselves. The histories call these Wu Bao, earthen-walled strongholds. These small fortresses replaced the county magistrate's office as the only unit of protection left in a lawless world. The state had retreated all the way back down to the village. Modern historians estimate the population loss differently, but the general consensus holds. North China's population collapsed from something like 50 million at the Han dynasty's peak down to a fraction of that. Chang'an and Luoyang, once so crowded you could barely move through their streets, genuinely became wastelands. The histories use 4 words to describe both capitals: overgrown with weeds and thorn. Wild grass and brambles grew taller than the city walls. This wasn't damage from a war. This was an entire civilization's operating system, dismantled down to the foundation by its own rulers. Liu Yuan died in 310. His son Liu Kang succeeded him. Liu Kang didn't carry his father's moral burden of restoring the House of Han. What he wanted was to finish off an empire that was already a hollow shell. In 311, the 5th year of Yongjia, Liu Kang sent his generals south. They annihilated what remained of Jin's main field army, then marched on Luoyang. The former imperial capital was systematically slaughtered and looted. More than 30,000 nobles, officials, and commoners killed. The emperor was taken captive. This was the disaster of Yongjia, the first time in Chinese history that the capital of a Han Chinese dynasty was breached by force by a people who had migrated in from the frontier, and the ruling class nearly erased down to the root. In 313, at a banquet, the captive emperor was ordered by Liu Kang to serve wine like a servant. In deliberate humiliation, he was poisoned days later. He was 30 years old. Luoyang was gone. What remained of Western Jin retreated to Chang'an and enthroned a new emperor. But this was a court that existed in name only. In 316, Liu Yuan's forces breached Chang'an. The emperor surrendered and was taken away as a prisoner. Western Jin ended there. 51 years after Sima Yan had founded it, on the ruins of Cao Wei. The following year, 317, a member of the imperial clan declared himself emperor at Jiankang, modern Nanjing, continuing the Jin name in the south as the Eastern Jin dynasty. North China entered nearly 3 centuries of division. Almost within the same century, on the far side of Eurasia, another classical empire was undergoing an eerily similar structural collapse. Since the 3rd century, Rome had leaned heavily on barbarian armies, settling Germanic tribes along the frontier as foederati, allied troops who fought for Rome in exchange for land and autonomy. At first, the arrangement looked like a bargain. Rome got a standing frontier army without raising or paying for one itself. But the risk buried in that arrangement was, structurally, the same one buried in Western Jin's system of princely fiefs. You hand real military power to a group whose loyalty runs to its own small community first, and to the empire only second, if at all. In 395, when Emperor Theodosius I died, the empire was formally split in 2 between his sons, not a collapse, but the moment Rome permanently lost the ability to act as one unified command. The western half never fully reunited with the east again. In 410, Alaric, king of the Visigoths, led his army into Rome and sacked it, the first time in nearly 800 years that the city had fallen to a foreign force. It's a brutal mirror image of Luoyang falling, A century earlier, half a world away, in 476, the Germanic general Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy of roughly 10 years old, named Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer didn't install a replacement, he simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Western Roman Empire didn't collapse in a single dramatic blow, it simply, quietly, stopped.
Western Jin and Western Rome fell in strikingly similar ways. Neither was crushed in one blow by a unified external enemy. Both were hollowed out, slowly, by internal power struggles, and both, with their own hands, invited in the very outsiders they'd once stationed on their borders as tools. Liu Yuan was invited in by Sima Zhong to help him beat other princes. The Germanic generals rose the same way, from commanders of hired troops to the actual masters of Rome, filling the power vacuum Rome kept creating for itself. There's a subtler parallel too, buried in each civilization's own elite. Western Jin's literati, facing a court rotten to its foundations, chose retreat over repair. They immersed themselves in pure conversation, abstract, philosophical debate, competing over who could sound the most detached, the most transcendent. They took cold food powder, a miracle drug laced with heavy metals, chasing its euphoric, feverish high. Toward the actual business of governing the state, they performed something close to theatrical contempt, as if caring about affairs of state was simply beneath a cultivated man. Late Rome's elites took two different roads to the same place. Some retreated into legally protected private estates, villas, and let the empire's public business become someone else's problem. Others devoted themselves to the newly ascendant Christian church, redirecting their attention from a collapsing worldly empire towards salvation in the next one. Two civilizations, two entirely different vocabularies, one debated metaphysics, the other found religion, and arrived at the same decision. When a ruling elite stops believing in and stops paying the cost of the community's continued survival, what's left of the shell eventually falls to whoever is still willing to pick up a weapon. In the Central Plains, those men were Liu Yuan and Liu Kong. In Rome, they were Alaric and Odoacer. Sima Zhong's "Why don't they eat meat porridge" has survived 1,000 years, not because it's absurd, but because it captures, with total precision, a single fact. When the summit of power has no awareness of the suffering beneath it, and no alertness to the structural cracks running through it, that empire's end is probably closer than anyone at the top believes. The curtain fell on the classical age at nearly the same time, on both ends of Eurasia. Different languages, different faiths, different political traditions, and yet the same ending arrived at the same way, not conquered from outside, but invited in one step at a time, from within. This is Kong Su's history, a cold eye on history, a warm-blooded concern for the present.